I don't believe that child abusers can be rehabilitated.
I've heard of one too many judges who've actually said to prosecutors or the police, your description's that's too detailed, that's offensive, that's too much. Or those photos are too graphic. But that's what happened.
I would like, personally, to see the judges sit down with survivors of child abuse.
Hi, I'm Gary Jubilant and beside me is Madeleine West. We're recording a podcast series called Predatory. We're making people become aware of child sexual abuse, how to prevent it, how to identify it, how to fight against it. And we have a guest today that's got a very interesting story, and he's heading up a charity called Fighters Against Child Abuse Australia. Our guest is Adam Washbourne. Adam, thanks for coming on.
No worries.
Now, first of all, just kudos to you. You're someone that's trying to make a difference in child sexual abuse, and it's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about, and it's something, and I think that's why it flourishes. But this charity organisation you got, FACA, Fighters Against Child Abuse Australia, you established it 12 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us a bit about that.
So we kicked off 12 years ago as a way to sponsor kids who had survived child abuse to do martial arts training initially. And then we found a need for other types of training like dance, music therapy, art therapy, gymnastics. Anything that essentially gets the kids moving, gets the endorphins rushing, gets the confidence up. And anything that gives them a sense of self, a sense of trust with an adult as well, because that's a really hard thing.
Absolutely, and that's been completely broken.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that a lot on the podcast series about what pedophilia looks like, what these predators do, how they operate, the impact it has on victims, but we've very rarely had an opportunity to talk about how victims move forward, meaningful ways that they can heal, and your organisation really manages to do that. Have you had any incredible success stories?
We've had a lot of incredible success stories. I'm lucky enough to be one of the instructors. So I teach martial arts myself at KMA Liverpool, and KMA was the second ever approved school for the FACA program. And ever since then, I've got to see firsthand the survivors come through the system, from enrolment all the way through to, self-realisation, black belt level, if you want to call it, and then leaving the organisation, which is exactly what we want.
One of the things that the charity was talking about, that comment, you wanted to stop the statement, but it doesn't happen here, and how ignorant people are to child abuse, child sexual abuse. Talk to us on that.
So each one of our programs has its own goal. The goal of the Phoenix program that I just spoke to is to help survivors to heal and to come to a place where they can be on their own and they can realise their own potential. The goal of the social media awareness campaign is exactly that. It's to stop the statement, not in my street, not in my suburb.
Because that's exactly how these operators continue doing what they're doing.
Exactly. And all too often the problem's swept under the rug.
Yep.
Yeah.
And people use statements like, oh, it's all right, it doesn't happen here.
Yeah.
It does. Sorry.
And not just here, not just your neighbourhood, but sometimes in your own home.
100%. In fact, most of the time abuse happens in the home.
Yeah, it's 9 out of 10.
9 out of 10, yeah. And so with that sort of statement, people can hopefully take a look around and say, hey, that kid's crying a lot, that kid screams a lot, that kid sits on their porch and stares at me as I walk past.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stomach aches, incontinence,
absolutely.
not wanting to eat, can't sleep.
All of those things, and hopefully people can say, hey, maybe something else is going on.
And maybe stop asking their little girl to sit on Uncle Johnny's lap when she really doesn't want to. And I mean, that sounds funny, but that's a red flag.
I'm laughing because I've heard that so many times.
Yeah.
And I've heard, but it was good enough for me when I was a kid. And my statement is always, was it? Was it really? Okay, so it might have worked for you, but what about your cousin? What about the kid next door?
What about your child?
Exactly.
And on that point, and one of your other mission statements that I think I found really powerful was that notion of bringing justice back to what is an inherently broken legal system. And on that note, I have to ask, as a mother, do you really think that the sentencing that's currently being offered by our courts for victims and perpetrators of childhood sexual assault meets the crime?
Not even a little bit. Not even.
When a murderer gets a life sentence.
Yeah. But this is the thing.
Slap on the wrist.
This is the thing. Survivors of child abuse will tell you that 60 years later, they're still suffering. 70 years later. We have people that come on our boards and say, that's correct, because I can confirm that 65 years after the abuse, I'm still suffering.
Yeah, and the average for people reporting is 24 years after the event.
Yes, yes. And people say, well, why did they take so long? Because they did. Because that's how long it took them to overcome the trauma enough to actually speak about it.
Yeah.
Let alone go before a judge, let alone go before a jury, let alone tell their story, have their story disseminated and destroyed by a cross-examination. That's just how long it takes.
And questions as to their sexual conduct or how they carry themselves in society or what they did. It reinforces the notion that it's their fault, that they're to blame, and that's what they're being told by the predator in the first place.
Exactly. The predators use the line, this is your fault. You made me do this.
Or you wanted it.
Or you wanted it. No, sorry. We do court support as well. We get a team of survivors who are specially trained to go into the courts and stand by the survivors in kind of like a witness assistance program.
That solidarity means so much because so many victims feel like they're alone.
Exactly.
And I shouldn't use the word victims. Survivors feel like they're alone. That it's
100%.
only happened to them and no one will ever understand.
Exactly. And so we've got people who have been through the court system who have succeeded or not with the court system as much as you ever can really succeed in our legal system. And they go, and one of the main things they keep coming back to us with is, they said it was their fault. And I'm like, weren't you supporting a girl who was 8 at the time? Yes. Huh? And okay, cool. So the lawyers turn around and told an 8-year-old that you came on to the defendant. How can you really justify those words?
You can't justify those words, and there needs to be a greater understanding of the impact it has on victims. When we talk about the effect of the crime and the punishment, now you've said that you don't think the punishment fits the crime, the type of sentencing that people get. Talk to us about that, because when you look at the impact, and you just said someone, 60 years down the track, they're still traumatised 65 years. What do you think a punishment would be fitting of a crime?
Look, personally, I don't believe that child abusers can be rehabilitated.
Yep.
Okay.
You're not alone in that.
Yeah. I feel like once they cross that line and they actively seek to destroy an innocent, vulnerable child in such a horrendous manner, I don't see that their desire, their ego can ever be sated by anything other than more destruction.
And the fact is, by the time they're caught, it's never a standalone offence. They've generally got a long line of little people that they've, in the same way, destroyed in the past.
How do you think we can get the courts to be more aware of the impact?
I would like, personally, to see the judges sit down with survivors of child abuse, because they hear victim impact statements, and we'll sit there in the courts. And look, when I say this, I'm not referring to all judges. There are some fantastic judges in the New South Wales circuit that I've been in front of.
And we've seen some incredible outcomes in the institutionalised crimes against.
Yes, absolutely. But for the vast majority of judges, I will say vast majority, they'll sit there and they'll hear the victim impact statement and they'll sound like someone's reading a shopping list. They just have absolutely blank face. And I'm well aware that the judges have restrictions. They can't show emotion. They can't show bias and all of these things. Otherwise, the defendant's lawyer will be sitting there waiting to pounce and cause a mistrial. I get all that. But you don't just sit there like they're reading a shopping list to you.
Yeah.
You listen. You engage with that person. And we hear judges say things like, this is a horrible crime you've committed. This is appalling. Here's a suspended sentence.
Yeah.
Huh?
How's that work?
There's a disconnect between.
Yeah.
This is a horrible crime. It's abhorrent. Yes, it is. And we'll be sitting there getting all ramped up, going, "Yes, it's abhorrent. Yes, keep talking, keep talking. It's appalling. How could you do this? You need to take a long, hard look at yourself in the mirror. Here's a suspended sentence."
Yeah.
So number one, they need to do that. They need to actually sit down with survivors of child abuse and talk to them and hear about the impacts and hear about the fact that when a car door bangs, that survivor will jump 6 foot in the air. They'll hear about the fact that the survivor can't have their bed facing the door. It's things like this that people...
Or being touched on the neck in a certain angle will set them off.
Set them off.
Adam, do you think of this because people don't talk about it?
Exactly.
People, like what we're having the conversation now, but this is not the type of conversation you have around the barbecue or with a group of people, because people feel very uncomfortable talking about it. So we've got to take that stigma away from the offence,
Yeah.
where people can openly talk about it.
And sit in the discomfort, because I've heard of one too many judges who've actually said to prosecutors or the police, your description's that's too detailed, that's offensive, that's too much, or those photos are too graphic. But that's what happened. That's what happened, and you're saying it's too graphic for you to listen to.
Yep. And that's, like you said, we need to normalise the actual medical terms about what has happened.
Yeah.
You need to normalise the fact that these kids have survived multiple surgeries to fix their internal organs as a result of what happened to them. Okay, you need to normalise the fact that these kids have had psychiatric bills that run up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars just to try and get them to a point where they can be healed enough to live a semi-normal life.
Just to get them to the point where they could acknowledge that it wasn't their fault.
Oh, 1,000%.
Just
that
can
would be
take
amazing.
A lifetime.
Exactly.
And on that point, I've got to ask, I think a lot of people don't know that there is no publicly accessible sex offender registry.
Nope.
Nowhere that you can go and check out someone who you think's a bit dodgy, a bit suspicious. There's a few rogue operators, a few different websites who will name and shame, but there is none. How important for you, for your organisation, for Australia at large, for the world at large, is it for us to have an accessible public registry for sex offenders?
Incredibly. It's been our mission since day one. Of the very first time we started a Facebook page, the very first point brought up by survivors was we need a register. And this is why we have a Working with Children check in Australia, or a blue card or an ochre card throughout different states. The problem with that is if, say, you were convicted of an offence against a child, you could then go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and say it's financially adversely affecting me and my ability to make an income. I want my Working with Children check back.
Yeah.
And we have at least 4 examples at FCAR that obviously we can't speak about where that exact scenario has happened.
Well, we've seen it in religious circles, haven't we? Moved on from parish to parish.
Absolutely. And so with that in mind, there's really no way to guarantee that the person that we are talking to, the person that we are talking to about sending our child for piano lessons, sending our child for martial arts lessons, sending our child to and entrusting with our child is not a convicted predator.
Yeah.
So the arguments against the child abuse register are there's a study done that says that it's not financially viable and it doesn't succeed. Now, the study that they keep holding up is from 2016. In 2016, there was less than 1 billion social media accounts. In 2022, there are more than 3 billion. So that's...
And there's 175,000 children under 13 signing onto a social media account every day.
Exactly.
Every day of the week.
Exactly. And so in places where they have a child abuse register, that child abuse register then has a social media site which directly links. Those social media posts are shared throughout that local community.
So that's their URLs, all of their identifying information
Everything
accessible.
is accessible. So in Australia, that doesn't happen because they hold up this 2016 study that says it's not really financially viable. So firstly, I say they need to redo that study because I can guarantee you they would be much more successful now that it's a social media environment. Number 2, I find the biggest problem with it is their measure of success. Their measure of success is just a downgrade in child abuse cases. To me, the biggest success is empowering parents and children to make informed decisions.
Adam, you're an inspiration. Thank you so much for your time today.
No worries at all.
Thanks, Adam.
No worries.
Cheers.